I live on Ledge Road. Carol Curran, I live on Ledge Road.
Laura Hartman, Sunset Garden.
John Simpson, Sunset Garden. Karen Spanier in Town of Ulster. You were up in the Town of Ulster.
Rena Budziak, Town of Ulster. Joseph Barbarito, Rifton.
Vicky Lucarini, Ledge Road, Town of Ulster.
Regis Obajeski, Ledge Road, Town of Ulster.
Julian DeFile, Ledge Road, Town of Ulster.
John Cannon, Ledge Road, Town of Ulster.
Elizabeth Schaefer, Socrates.
And Sue McConaughey, 238 Rise 6th Street. I am ground zero. I am 28 feet from the back.
Oh, man.
And 129 people whose properties, backyards provide the third water that we don't hear about for this project.
Bill Canyon, I live next to Sue.
Ground zero too.
I'm Rebecca Mears, I live in Midtown Kingston.
Wayne Spanier, Town of Ulster.
And we have board members today in the Town of
Rocky
Ulster.
Sopranos. John Morrow.
Thank you so much for coming.
I'll introduce myself. I'm Sue Rosenberg. I'm from Solgardies, and I work with Coalition Against Proven Pipelines.
Patty?
Okay.
I'm Patty Goodwin. I live in Glenford in West Hurley.
All right, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Rebecca. We appreciate everyone coming out tonight. My name is Jeff Anzavino. I'm the Director of Land Use Advocacy for Scenic Hudson. So we're going to give you a little introduction to SEQR and how SEQR can be used to make sure that the impacts that might result from the power plant are reduced or avoided. SEQR was passed in 1972, this New York State Environmental Quality Review Act, and its intention is to make sure that the benefits and the impacts of projects are balanced. Its mandate is that agencies must choose alternatives that are consistent with the social, economic, and other essential considerations to the maximum extent practicable, and that's kind of like the catch. Is it practicable or practical? That they avoid or minimize or avoid adverse environmental effects, including those effects that are revealed in the SEQR process that will result in this environmental impact statement that will be produced. What is proposed? This is a hybrid 20 megawatt gas-fired power plant and a battery storage facility. This is referred to as a peaker plant that would provide power generation in times when it's needed. And it's on 4 acres of a 120 acre site that I believe is for the most part or almost entirely wooded. The plant will operate it based on the needs of the electric grid, but it could be used up to 24 hours a day. The plant would include one exhaust stack that would have 2 elements in it that is could be up to 80 feet tall, and there would be a 50,000 gallon diesel storage tank that could be used to operate the plant when the natural gas would not be available. And the specifics of the proposed projects are subject to change as this SEQR process unfolds. In other words, this is what's proposed today, and as the process goes on and things are learned about the environmental resources, alternatives are proposed, and things are deliberated, this is all subject to change. So next we can see a map that shows a portion of the site where the plant is proposed. So you can see on the upper left-hand side, Frank Sotil Boulevard. There is an entrance road. I think there's a gate at the front. I think they said there'd also be a gate closer to the plant. The driveway goes in. There'd be a wetland crossing. The plant would be in that sort of rectangular, circular area, oblong area in the middle, with the diesel storage right there next to it. So you can see there's a lot of wetlands on the site surrounding this plant.
Excuse me, I have a question. The, in the initial proposal, there was supposed to be 2 steps.
Yeah, they said 2 stacks, and I'm not sure if they meant 2 separate stacks. My reading of the scope was that there'd be 2 stacks in one element.
Yeah, they clarified that, and I'm unsure whether it was a different proposal at first or whether they just weren't clear about it. And they also, originally it was supposed to be up to 100 feet tall, and now they are saying a maximum of 80 feet tall. So you can see that there's already been some changes, however minor, but through this process, you know, the project can really take on a different shape.
So what's at risk with this proposal? Climate change and air emissions, visual impacts, water quality, surface water and wetlands, and the underlying aquifer, cultural resources, and threatened and endangered species. So with respect to climate change, the applicants claim that this could actually help things by providing a bridge between sort of the old power plant generation that uses coal and oil to the new, what we're all hoping is going to happen in the future, wind energy, solar energy, and more renewable future. They say that there needs to be these sort of bridge or peaker plants that generate power when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. But that's something that I think we're going to have to all get clarification on with as the SEQR process goes on. The air emissions, according to their scope, will be carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. The visual impacts, I think, will be related mostly to the stack, because the building is rather low and it's in the middle of this site that's wooded, but the you know, this all depends on the size of the trees around the stack, the height of the stack, and what the surrounding terrain. So this has to be determined by visual analysis and visual simulations. But we do know that, and if you look at the map on the screen, the entire east side of the river is National Historic Landmark District and scenic area of statewide significance. So there is really a lot at stake if the stacks would rise above the tree line. And then also something that's not acknowledged in the scope is whether or not there is going to be a plume and how often that plume would be visible. So it's not just the stacks, whether they stick up above the trees, but we have to look at that plume as well. Should we take questions as we go along, or would we rather have them?
It's up to you.
I have a comment about the plume, because we don't even know about this, and the height of the stacks. Because if the wind isn't blowing, where's that plume and all that going to go?
Well, that's exactly right.
And then the odor that could come from these stacks.
Yeah,
And
odor is something
how about hydrocarbons? You know, I mean, you're burning fossil fuels, so there's hydrocarbons in there also.
Okay, so maybe we'll take the comments at the end. So, okay.
So maybe the best approach, if you do have a question, is if you could write them down, and we will get to questions.
Yeah, we'll answer all the questions.
This is a 30-minute presentation. We have lots of time. Okay.
All right. So, so the visual impacts, I think, mostly relate to the stack and the plume, which is not addressed in the scope, and how that might impact the river, the National Historic Landmark District on the other side of the river, and there may be some spots on the east side of the river, public roads, where the stack or the plume would be visible as well in the town of Ulster or the city of Kingston, or perhaps other locations. Water quality and wetlands, this relates mostly to, there are a lot of wetlands on the site. Some are state jurisdiction, some are federal jurisdiction, and there are others that may not be mapped. So we have to make sure that all the wetlands on the site, the smaller ones that are mapped properly. And the interconnection of all these wetlands is very important as well. In addition, there is an aquifer underneath the site on the southern part of the site, and how any kind of stormwater that may be polluted might drain into that aquifer, or how any of the petrochemicals that are stored on the site, the diesel, if any of that leaks, that would be a concern into the aquifer. Cultural resources, there's been a lot of documentation on this ridge about the presence of Native American activity on the site, so the cultural resources would have to be studied on this site specifically. And then threatened and endangered species, the ones that we know about, are 2 species of bats. That's what is at risk that we know of right now. Haley Carlock will talk about the process and how we can all get involved to make a difference.
Sure, and I'm gonna stand up just because I'm more comfortable that way, if that's all right. So, the process may seem like the more, boring part of this. It's really interesting and kind of exciting to talk about, the negative impacts and, what are all the natural resources on this site. But the process itself is very important because this is how you can participate. You can really affect change and make change to the project, or defeat it entirely if that's your goal. So there are a number of permits that are required for this project. We're talking here today mostly about the SEQR review, over which the town board has jurisdiction, but there are a number of permits that all need to be granted by various government agencies in order for the project to actually be built and operate. And this is not a completely exhaustive list up here, but it hits, I think, all the big ones. So there's a couple of federal agencies. The Army Corps of Engineers has to issue a permit for wetlands disturbance. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to be consulted because there are known occurrences of endangered species in the area. There's 4 permits that the New York State DEC has to issue, from stormwater discharges to petroleum bulk storage, and of course the air emissions permit. OPRHP is the acronym for state parks, basically, and they also have to be consulted because of the historic and archaeological resources in the area. And then, as I said, the town is the lead agency for the SEQR review. They also have jurisdiction over the actual site plan approval. And the planning board also has to approve a lot line adjustment, which is basically the consolidation of those 3 smaller parcels into one big parcel. That's part of their application. So the important takeaway here is there are lots of opportunities for you to weigh in on most, but not all, of these permits. There's a required public comment period, notice and comment, and or a public hearing. So these are all different ways that you can make your voice heard, your concerns heard throughout the process. So as I said, the town of Ulster is the SEQR lead agency, but there are multiple permits from various agencies that are required. And the way that SEQR works into this is that before any of the permits can be issued, the entire SEQR process has to be gone through, and what are called SEQR findings, which is what comes out of the final environmental impact statement, need to be made. So none of these permits can be issued until the SEQR process comes to its conclusion, not the local permits, not the state permits. And the record for SEQR, so all of the comments that are received, all of the public statements that are made at the official public hearings, all of the documents to come out of it, from the final scope to the final environmental impact statement, they essentially create the record on which these permits have to be issued by the various government agencies. So it's a really, really important part of the process. This is a very complicated, but I think handy little flowchart, and I have some copies of it up here if people are interested. And it's actually also available on the DEC website, and I have a link to it. And the link is great if you're really interested in kind of finding out more, because you can actually click on these various boxes on the website and find out more about each one. So I'm not going to belabor this entire chart, but just hit on a few things to give you the context of how SEQR unfolds, and then we'll talk more about where we are right now in the scoping process. So you see that once a lead agency determines there are significant the potential for at least one significant adverse environmental impact, which here the town board has determined that, they issue a positive declaration, and that means that they've got to prepare the full environmental impact statement. You see here that scoping is optional, which it is right now in SEQR, but fortunately the town board has decided to do a scoping process, which is really important, and we'll get more into that in a moment. The scope sets up a table of contents for the draft environmental impact statement, which is the study of all of those potentially significant environmental impacts. Now, typically the draft environmental impact statement is a document that's prepared by the project sponsor. So usually they'll hire a consultant or a team of consultants and they'll prepare the thing. But ultimately, it's the lead agency's job to determine whether that draft environmental impact statement is adequate. So the lead agency's got to look at it and say, is this consistent with the final scope that we issued? Does this really take into account all of the impacts that we want to discuss? Are the methodologies sound? Are the conclusions supported? And if the lead agency decides, this draft environmental impact statement we prepared is not adequate, then they have to send it back to the applicant with a specific list of deficiencies, basically. You need to beef up these studies, you need to look closer at this and all of that. Once the lead agency says, okay, this draft, in our view is adequate, is complete, then it's published and noticed for public comment. And there is always a public comment period on a draft environmental impact statement. It's a minimum of 30 days. It's usually longer. There is no maximum. People will tell you this part of the process can go on for a very long time and does sometimes. But there is always an opportunity for public input. Often, but not always, there'll also be public hearings held where you can go and make statements, and then there's always an opportunity to submit written comments. In certain cases, the lead agency will actually decide to hold a public hearing, which will be almost like a trial-like hearing experience, and that's really uncommon, but it does happen, and the lead agency can decide to do that. The final EIS comes out of that, and it is that final EIS, and the EIS must include a response to comments. So they have to take the substance of all the comments and respond to them. They don't have to respond to each individual commenter, but they need to say, okay, a lot of people raised this issue with the plume, let's say, this is how we dealt with it, this is how we thought it was already taken into consideration, or this is what we did to take it into consideration further in the final version. And it's that final EIS on which the SEQR findings are made, and those findings, again, form the basis for the permits that are issued for the project. So where we are now, as everyone who's here probably knows, is we are in the scoping part of the process. And you see up there a quote from the resolution that the town board adopted. And again, they have identified several potentially significant environmental impacts that need to be evaluated and mitigated before the project can move forward. And that's really important. So now we're in the scoping process. There is a public meeting scheduled for February 22nd. I believe it's at 7 p.m. We have these little corner sheets of paper which you can take or hand them out to people who maybe haven't been attending all of these meetings to let them know when that is, where you can make statements about what you think should go into the scope, and then written comments are due by March 22nd, and so we've got 20 additional days from what the town board initially announced, so a total of 50 days for comment. And I am going to talk now about why it's really important for you to comment on the scope, even though it seems like kind of a wonky part of the process that's kind of technical. It's not, and it's very important because it really is the foundation for that draft environmental impact statement. So the draft scope, and those of you who have looked at the draft scope that's been issued for this have probably noticed this. It's basically like a detailed table of contents. It doesn't have the substance of all the studies, the results of all the studies, the conclusions, but it tells you what things need to be studied, what needs to be looked at, and sometimes the methodologies that will be employed to look at those studies. But it's very important because the project sponsor has to follow that scope when they do their environmental impact statement. So, if there's something that's not included in the draft scope, it's much less likely that the applicant is later going to be held accountable to talk about that issue if it's left out of that draft scope. So it's really important. And it's important to get ready to comment now. I mean, you folks, most of you in the room, if I heard correctly, are from the town of Ulster, many at ground zero. You guys know, the very local area, even to an extent that maybe the town board members don't all know. You guys know the on-the-ground impacts, what's really going on there, specific things that need to be looked at, and your local knowledge is really, really important. So it's important to let the lead agency know what those impacts are and that they need to be studied. So here's the way that you can frame these different issues. And again, they don't have to be super technical comments. You don't, some of you may have a science background and that's great. If you don't, it doesn't have to be technical, but it does need to identify what are those potential impacts of concern. And those are just, some examples, certainly not exhaustive. Why they're significant, why these are issues of significance, and what's the breadth of study. What exactly needs to be looked at to fully examine this issue. And this is really important, identify potential alternatives to the project. We like to say that the heart of SEQR is the alternatives analysis. Jeff said it at the beginning of the presentation. SEQR requires an evaluation of reasonable alternatives. So if there are alternatives to this project that you can identify that are reasonable alternatives, it's important to put those forward. I mean, don't say make a supermarket instead of a power plant because that's not reasonable, for example, but if there's a reasonable alternative, including no action, but it could be other things, other potential options, it's important to suggest those so that they might have to be looked at. And certainly you can voice your position on the plan in your scoping comment, and that's fine, but what's really going to have an impact on the process at this point is identifying those potential impacts, because then, if they are deemed significant, they will need to be studied in the EIS. So focus on those local impacts that you think need to be studied. And here, again, this is not exhaustive at all, but just an idea of some kinds of things you might want to mention. Stormwater runoff, those visual impacts we talked about. Carbon and other emissions, including their impact on climate change and consistency with New York State's policies. The cultural resources, potential inconsistency with the town's comprehensive plan. And talking about economic impacts is fair game too. SEQR's primarily focused on environmental impacts, but economic considerations do carry some weight in SEQR, so property values, those sorts of things, it's legitimate to bring those up in the SEQR process. And I think Jeff will finish things off, which is talking a little bit about where we go from here, what the next steps are, and how you can keep informed and involved.
All right, thanks, Haley. So this is, as Haley said, really the critical point in the process. So lots of scoping comments, both by attending the meeting and by sending them. So the meeting that's coming up on the 22nd, hopefully a lot of people will come to the meeting, provide written comments on the draft scope. I think you could probably also speak at the meeting. Usually the town board will allow some oral comments, and then talk about your local impacts to your community, even regional and other impacts as well. And it's important that we identify other alternatives. The draft scope right now is very weak on the alternatives. They just talk about discussing alternative sites and alternative technologies. So if we can come up with other sites that might be available, that could be sort of on, I know this one is on a gas line, it's near the electrical lines, finding other sites that can meet those needs that might be available should be included. And other technologies that can be used for battery storage or solar fields instead of the gas-fired proposal that they've got on the table. Also, in addition to your comments, comments by other organizations, other local officials should be encouraged to be included as well. So also sign up for updates. Kingston Citizens is doing a great job. Scenic Hudson, Riverkeeper, keep in touch with us. Other groups, Citizens for Local Power, the Catskill Mountain Keeper, and the Coalition Against Pilgrim Pipelines. The public scoping meeting on the 22nd. Remember that the last day for comments is March 22nd. And make sure that you contact and let your local officials know what you think about the proposal. And I just want to take this moment to say that we appreciate the professionalism that the town board has conducted so far. They understand the significance of this to the point where they called this a positive declaration. They identified the need for an environmental impact statement, and we look forward to participating in the process along with you all as well. So at that point, now we can have some questions and discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for coming to explain the SEQR process to to us. This has been very helpful. I also want to express my gratitude to the town board for the positive declaration. I agree that is responsible for us now having this process, so all of that's very good. I have a question specifically about our comments or one's comments on the scoping process. As I understand it, the scoping process will be filled out or perhaps made more particular for the applicant to answer. There are some questions that I think are important for the applicant, and there are also some questions that I think are maybe beyond the applicant, in particular to the town board. Would that be appropriate? Let me give you two examples. One is that the amount of emissions, the kind and the amount of emissions. Let me back up a little further. For the scoping process, it seems to me that the full environmental assessment form, parts 1 and 2, inform the scoping process. So I really believe that our acquaintance with both of those documents are essential to, in a sense, understanding the draft scope. An example, which I was about to say. The example is in part 1 of the EAF, the environmental assessment form, there was nothing listed on the kind or the amount of emissions. Now I don't know if that was left blank on the EAF because it wasn't required or it wasn't known. I'm not sure, but that was blank. On part 2, there are the emissions, 6 of them that are listed in part 2, and they're also it's also quantified with a certain quality of emissions. Juxtaposing that with a presentation that was made on January 17th, there was a bar graph on slide 8 that indicated the comparison of the proposed power plant, this gas-fired power plant with reciprocating engines compared to natural gas, probably with turbine engines, to petroleum to coal, and it was a rising scale of difference, making by comparison that this application is favorable. It noted a certain amount of carbon dioxide emission per megawatt hour, and then in part 2 it noted carbon dioxide and five other emissions by tonnage. And if you were to extrapolate the emissions of carbon dioxide of 195 per megawatt hour into tonnage, it would be something like 17,000 tons of carbon dioxide. In the part 2 listing of the amount of emissions for carbon dioxide, it was listed at greater than 1,000. Well, there are a lot of numbers greater than 1,000, and 17,000 are certainly greater than 1,001. So those are things that I think the applicant can answer adequately. How do they get to the tonnage number? Extrapolating from a per hour mile. So those are more technical questions, but it led me to believe that either they didn't know or they didn't know at the time that what the emissions were. Now the second part is it appropriate to pose questions that are really for the town and the town board and town committees beyond the applicant's knowledge. In other words, there is a part in the scoping, in the draft scoping, that had to do with purpose. It's somewhere in the middle. I don't know what the reference was offhand, but it had to do with purpose. That was why are we having this and why are we having this here? And I think there needs to be questions asked of what kind of research was done on this applicant's credentials as well as their credibility as a provider of this kind of service vis-a-vis whatever else is going on in the country with this kind of thing. And furthermore, comparing the gas-fired power plant to, let's say, a solar field, a 20 megawatt or a 40 megawatt solar field with some kind of battery storage, whether that's the ion, I forget what it is, battery storage, let's say compared to salt water battery. You know, was there research going on further with regard to purpose? Why would this be appealing to the town besides a greater tax, adding to the tax revenue?
Those are all legitimate things. Talking
They are
about
legitimate.
what economically is this project going to bring? What are the economic upsides? What are the economic downsides? What are the alternatives? Has an alternative putting a 20 megawatt or a 5 megawatt or a 10 megawatt, solar array on the same site, has that been evaluated? Should that be evaluated? Those are all legitimate things to try to add to the draft scope, and that the applicant would have to look at and the town would have to consider. Now, the applicant might say, well, I don't want to put a solar array, and they don't have to. Nobody's certainly going to make them do that, but the town has to look at whether that is an alternative that would meet the basic purpose of, providing electricity and would do so with fewer environmental impacts.
And also something a little softer, like quality of life, health. And as far as the applicant is concerned, I'm not sure that's in his wheelhouse, much less whether he would care about that. They're looking at this as a business proposition. He was very clear on January 17th that this was a business proposition, and other alternatives weren't as profitable as this one. I get it. But that's a question for the town. So that is appropriate to ask in a draft scope. Thank you.
One of the interesting questions that has been raised is, how does this plant benefit this area directly? And I think we've been told that utilities are not allowed to dedicate power to this area. It's a regional issue, and it's mostly likely to benefit Westchester, folks in Westchester County and south of here. You mentioned the economic aspect of this, and I think that we need to broaden that scope to include the financial aspect of this as well. We need to understand how much is this project going to cost? How is it going to benefit us? As you know, there is a pilot consideration here. And so we have to understand, how is this project, perhaps it's not going to benefit this in terms of having utility serve this area directly. But certainly we need to understand in a greater scope, what is the financial benefit, if any? And as you know, from the county perspective, the revenue that comes back to the town is minimal. And that's a big concern, and I think that the town board understands that as well. And
there's other meetings going on here, I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry.
Okay, I thought maybe you might have an answer. But anyway, when we talk about economic aspect, we also need to understand that we are allowed to talk about and ask questions related to financial aspects of this.
Absolutely, yeah, and like I said before, obviously SEQR is primarily focused on environmental, but the economic and quality of life aspects are absolutely part of this, and they're part of the balancing act that the town has to do. And the town does need to look at those things.
If it's going to be benefiting the people down in Westchester or even closer to the city, why does it have to be here?
And that's a question that can be asked in the scope. Why is this site, and what are the benefits to our town?
Excuse me for my ignorance, this is first time I've ever been involved with anything with SEQR or anything. After you're done with all your environmental impacts, all these meters and whatnots, can you make the decision of no, like as far as denial to this, or does it have to go from the town to do that?
What do you mean, you?
As far as the SEQR, your committee, the committee here, or is that something that the town?
The town as the lead agency has the authority over, they have, things they have to do. They have to consider public input. They have to do things within the parameter of the law and regulation. But the town has the authority to make the SEQR findings and ultimately the site plan approval. But like I said, there are other agencies that also have to issue permits, but ultimately, that's their job.
Can you explain the release of a draft scope? Because I was interested in, with the lead agency process, there's a letter that's put out, and there has to be a dispute for lead agency. And with the draft scope, I noticed that the planning board is listed as an involved agency, but I think for zoning or for the site delineation. So it's separate than the town as having the authority over the site plan. But typically draft scopes, do they go through planning? Do they go, how does it, is there a typical way that it works before a draft scope is released to the public?
Well, I think it's just the town board is the lead agency, and I think they have the authority over the scope. The planning board wouldn't have any other, so they could participate in the scoping process. The planning board could certainly make scoping comments. Any of the other interested or parties or involved agencies could have scoping comments, but it's really up to the town board as lead agency to approve the final scope. And as far as I know, I don't know that there's sort of an appeal process. If somebody doesn't like the scope, that I don't believe anybody could, say, object to something that's missing.
Yeah.
How about right here first?
Who are the population of people who are invited to participate and whose opinions are being taken into account? Is it just people in town of Ulster or in Kingston area? Or?
In the scope or the whole process?
In the whole county or anywhere?
It's a public process.
Yeah, I mean, it's open to the public, and certainly, the town board may, weigh town members' views more heavily, but if someone from California can comment, and their comment, if relevant, is legitimate and has to be considered. Sorry,
Go ahead, you go first. I've spoken.
There was some notice about trying to extend the comment period from 30 days to 90 days. Is that, is that still on the table? I mean, trying to get the comment period longer so that there can be more input, longer time for...
So, sure. So the original comment period was 30 days, so comments would have been due on the 2nd of March. And we've been pushing for it to be 90 days for, because this project is, so complicated and so major and important, and there's so much public interest. The town board just this past week, I think, extended the comment period to 50 days. So now comments are due on March 22nd. But if people would like to continue to press the board for a longer comment period, you are welcome to do that. But they have issued an extension of 20 additional days. And much like there's no, formal process to object to the scope itself, there's no formal process to object to the length of a comment period for a draft scope. But, if folks think they need more time, continue to press for more time.
We have a sheet that if anybody didn't sign up online, you can sign for that 90 day if you'd like to see it, and you can pass it around. But you signed up online, then don't sign this. Yeah.
No one else?
Just one related to the question about who can ask questions. If this person from California asked a question about this, it is equally considered as the person, Joanne or Sue, who are right next door to where this is proposed. Those questions all carry equal weight?
It's up to the board to weigh the comments. It's difficult to assign a weight to each one. I mean, typically, especially for a project where there's a municipal board as lead agency, they are going to pay special attention to the opinions of people in their community, their constituents, as they should. But on the other hand, if somebody from California has a really in-depth comment that strikes at the heart of an issue that's relevant to this, then maybe they'll give a lot of weight to that too. So again, I don't imagine a lot of people from California are going to be commenting, but it is a public process, and everyone can weigh in.
Thank you.
Is there any appeal process after the final SEQR decision is made?
Yes, once there is what they call a final agency action, so you gotta wait till the end of the process. You can't have you can't arguably, there are circumstances in which you could argue that milestones are de facto decisions, but generally, you have to wait till the end of the line, till that final decision is made, and then just like any government decisions in the state of New York for state or local government, if you want to challenge them legally, a final decision, there's a process called an Article 78. So that would be at the end of the process, though.
When the comments are all submitted on the 20th, I guess two-part question, submitted, at that point, the applicant can look at the comments and the scope that's submitted and it's complete, that's submitted to the applicant. Can the applicant say, we're not interested?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they can,
Can also the town say, this isn't the right project for us? Can they do that without it becoming a legal issue?
The town has, and maybe I'll let the town board members answer this, but they have to see the process through to some extent. They can't just say in the middle of the applicant preparing the EIS, oh, we decided we actually don't want your project to go away. They have to see the permitting and the SEQR review process through to the end and base it on the record.
It'll just turn it right around. Everybody has a right to build or put an application in. If not, if we say no, they'll file the Article 78 against us. So the Article 78 works for you, works for him too.
It's a process, we can't be arbitrary.
So, at what part of the process do you make a decision? Yes or no?
No, we got to go through the whole scoping process and the SEQR process before we do anything. This is going to drag out, let me tell you that right now.
The scoping process and the SEQR process gives us information because we are not experts on this, and that's why we're here tonight, to be educated, to learn, and it's a learning process for us throughout the entire thing. These people answered the questions that you asked, somebody asked about if somebody from California asks a question, does it weigh equally with us? It weighs maybe differently. But if their question is relevant, and if their information is relevant to this project that either is in favor of or against, we look at it and judge it by its value.
Yeah, we'll take every comment. So I think the meeting should be run like you're doing tonight, questions at the end. Let them speak, have your questions ready, write them down. Because the last meeting seemed to get tied up quite a bit, and I think they got overwhelmed. Like everybody's shooting at them from all sides. But if you hold your questions to the end, I think the meeting will go smoothly because this is going to go on. You know, the scoping process and everything's going to go on.
And so just to clarify,
we have a question here,
I just have a quick question. If everything is positive with the SEQR process, do you have to agree? Can you make an independent decision?
We can't necessarily, if they meet all the standards, we can't necessarily say no. If we can't be arbitrary.
Wait a minute. What I think she's asking is that even though the applicant answers all the questions and everything, and you go through the whole SEQR review, could it be that the board decides that this is not a good project for the town?
Probably not. Probably, that's not our decision. At that point, it's a business decision from the applicant. If they meet all the standards environmentally and safety, and they pass the SEQR and they pass all the other things, then if we were to say no just because we didn't feel like it becomes arbitrary, then we'd become liable.
No, but I think the question is, that was the reason I asked earlier about the quality of life being an important aspect of the purpose, and I said that's a question that that's a question that cannot be answered by the applicant. It needs to be answered by the town board.
Well, I don't think so. The question of quality of life is going to be answered in SEQR, and if they can answer that satisfactorily in SEQR, we can't say, well, we think there's going to be a quality of life issue, and SEQR says there's not. We can't. We're all hiring experts to look at this and come in with a report. And if the reports come in and say no, then we have to look at the experts
Haley, did you want to clarify?
that have come in.
Yeah, no, he's correct, but I just want to sort of clarify, and it was on one of the first slides we showed, and that the purpose of SEQR is to try to mitigate basically significant adverse environmental impacts to the maximum extent practicable. So there's like a lot of sort of qualifying language there, maximum extent practicable and all of that, but essentially, I mean, the board does have, legal standards it has to follow. He's absolutely right. They can't arbitrarily just say, you know what, you meet all the standards, the project looks like it's not really going to have any major impacts, but we just don't like you. No, that would be a setup for them to be sued, like he said, by the applicant. But if the town board feels that the environmental impacts cannot be mitigated to an extent that meets the standards of the law, then they can decide that the project can't go forward. Or they can say the project as proposed maybe doesn't meet those standards, but if you lessen the scale, put these additional safety measures in place, then it would meet the standards. And so you can go forward with the project, but you have to meet all of these conditions. But they do have to, look back to the law and the standards when they make that evaluation.
Okay, so you talk about standards, and they have to meet the the law, okay? Who sets standards, okay? Who sets the standards? Is it DEC, New York DEC, the federal government? Excuse me?
Department of Health.
Well, I think she went through all the standards before. She went through the whole list of places that have to give approvals, the DEC, the federal wetlands, and so forth and so on. Those are all the people that have to make various approvals.
Yeah, there's a number of different agencies that have standards, and if you're looking at endangered species, well then you're looking at either DEC or Fish and Wildlife. If you're looking at air emissions, then you're looking to DEC, and you're looking at regulations that they have. So it depends on what you're looking at, what area you're looking at. Okay. Some are very concrete and very quantitative and clear, and others are a little bit more qualitative. So,
is there a benefit to the town to have this?
The benefit to the town.
Financially, what does the town gain financially having this project here? Anything?
The benefit to the town, again, is going to be the tax income from the project, and my feeling is the way things are going right now with environmental things, with cars, battery cars and stuff like that, we're going to need a lot more energy statewide, nationwide, to charge the batteries in all these cars. Right now, if everybody had an electric car, we wouldn't have enough power to charge the car.
That plant's not going to help that, right? That plant has nothing to do with cars.
That plant is going to supply additional electricity into New York State for future needs of New York State.
Even the town of Ulster?
So just based on your
Yes,
comment,
even the town of Ulster.
you seem like you think that this is a positive.
No, I didn't. My comment was, we're here to be educated, because we're not experts on this. That's my comment.
Right.
Don't misrepresent what I said.
So can I just interject for 1 second? I think, so in SEQR, we were talking about economic benefits. So cost-benefit analysis, for instance, what the town is getting from the project versus potentially what the town may be losing, for lack of a better word, in terms of quality of life. These things can be studied.
Absolutely.
And they're very costly studies, which would be something that the applicant would be beholden to perform.
Typically, it's borne by the applicant, the studies that need to be done.
Rebecca, I think that benefit, though, has to be weighed against the potential loss on the part of people that are impacted by this.
Oh, yeah, that's
So there is a cost. There's a cost there.
And that's the study it sounds like quality of life, home values?
Yep, those are
Potentially,
totally legitimate
It's
things.
usually,
Community
it's usually called
character.
community character.
Community character.
Quality of life, I think, is a little more squishy and harder to
Right.
define.
Yeah, and that actually, when I first asked questions about plume and then noise and you know, visibility and, you know, so you're getting, and this is a very tight neighborhood. So what you're doing is that people, if you have a smell, okay, that's going to be in the neighborhood, if you have noise, this all is going to decrease property values because people are not going to be able to sell if they want to sell, or they're not going to be able to get their price. So that it's a really good thing that you bring up, that there has to be a cost-benefit analysis because this is really serious to the people that live in this neighborhood. Because you're putting a power plant so close to it that it is really going to be impacted. It really is. And I invite the town board to please come up into this neighborhood and walk it.
Walk it with us.
Walk it. Because it is it's a really nice, pristine neighborhood. It's quiet, but yet it's very close to everything, and it's very convenient for the people who live there. And so this is really going to impact the quality of life here because there's this power plant. Now, to me, that seems like it needs to be in an industrial area rather than a residential area. How does it really fit into a manufacturing and office zoning to me? You know, I don't see a power plant being right next to a residential community.
700 feet behind our houses.
Yeah, it's very, very, very close.
So just to bring it back, because tonight what we're doing is we're trying to understand how to document these concerns and submit them. So my next question is...
Can I speak to that?
Please,
though? You're absolutely right that noise and odor and the visual impact of the plume are all legitimate areas of study and ripe for comment on the scope. So we should be asking, will a plant generate noise? How will it be measured? Measured to your property line? Odors, how will that be measured? Those are things that you should be asking in the scope.
Yeah, because it depends on the direction of the wind that day, or if it even isn't blowing.
How are comments submitted? How does the public do this? What's the part?
So generally, they're accepted either by mail, you can mail them in to the town board, or by email. And these days most people submit it by email, but you can absolutely send it in through regular mail. And I believe we have the physical address and the email address on those little cards. And we'll definitely make sure people are aware of how they can get those comments. Sorry with that.
I would suggest comments be sent to the town clerk,
Yeah,
not the town board.
that's a good point.
The town clerk is the keeper of the records, and the town clerk will disseminate them to the town board, and they'll be made part of the permanent public hearing or record, or part of the scoping. Yes?
John, would it be possible on the scope? On the scope, it actually says to send to the supervisor. Is there a way to make that change if it should go through the clerk? Just so that
It's fine to go to the supervisor, because he will send it directly to the clerk.
Oh, okay.
But if it goes to the clerk, she'll send it to the supervisor. But my point is, it needs to be, one person of contact, and they'll disseminate it to the appropriate people.
And what's the name of the town clerk?
Susie Reedy.
Susie Reedy?
Suzanne.
Yes, ma'am.
So, and as far as the town board, and I think I can speak for Rocco and myself anyway, and most of the other members, the town board has no decision in any direction whatsoever in this. We're in the middle of a process that we have to look at the entire process. We're not in favor of the process or opposed to it. We're here to learn, listen to the people, listen to the scoping, look at the results from the experts and so forth. Then we're going to have to make a decision. It's going to be a long process. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to be done behind closed doors. It's going to be out in the open, and we're completely transparent, and that's important that you know that. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something to you as a board member in that comment that you had just made about your feeling about all the electric cars that are coming down the pike. I mean, in my mind, it's the issue about where this is being placed, but for me, it's also an issue about the fact that it is a fracked gas and diesel-fueled power plant. And I'm just, it occurring to me when you're talking about these electric cars, well, what the heck is the point of technologies creating electric cars? Well, in my mind, it is, well, because we're talking about climate change, we're talking about eliminating fossil fuel emissions. So I don't understand if that's the technology that you're focusing on, why would you then get fossil fuel to provide for that technology? Just the concept that didn't make sense to me around that. I mean, if you're going for electric, you're going for cleaner energy sources, you're going for cars to go to electric, well, why would you say, well, yeah, the infrastructure for those cars is going to be fossil fuel based or frac based? I mean, if you can do the technology.
I don't think I said that. I said we're going to need a lot more electricity in Ulster County, in New York State, in the United States of America, as we get more and more electric cars. I think that's what I said.
So I'm building on what you're saying is yes, clearly, but
I didn't make any suggestion how the electricity should be made or shouldn't be made because I certainly don't know that.
okay, so then I'm just saying to you as a board member, then it makes a difference how that energy
And the
is
reality
generated.
is, if somebody came in here and wanted to put up a wind farm, we're going to be having the same meetings tomorrow because everybody's going to say those turbines are ugly. I don't want them. I don't want to see them from the thruway as people drive through Ulster County, and we're all going to be back in the same room.
Right, so
It
that's
doesn't matter.
a different, you know, a different bunch of comments for the SEQR process would be for the wind farm. In terms of this process, yeah, I don't want to be saying that you're saying that it's okay, but I'm saying that is part of the issue around this particular project, is that it's the way the energy is being generated.
And just remember, all that gas that you're talking about, the fossil fuel gas that's in the line from Central Hudson, that comes from all different kinds of sources from all across the country, and it's all intermixed together. And we all have it running into our houses, and we're all cooking with it, we're all using it for X, Y, and Z, and we have no control over where that happens. That's a whole nother story.
No,
where that
absolutely,
fuel
but
happens.
we're just looking toward the future here.
They were talking about trucking in diesel fuel for this.
As a backup.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they're
It's
still
gonna be
taking
stored
it in.
there.
It's being stored.
Yes, it is.
Diesel fuel is like probably the safest and easiest thing to store of any fuel.
I don't mind storing
I don't like
it,
the
John,
so can we
but
do it?
if they start burning it,
There's just
That's
been
right.
a couple
because
questions in the.
we have run into shortages on natural gas throughout the Hudson Valley in the last 10 years. So when they start burning it in that plant, that is going to be a major impact to the air quality in my backyard. And I'm just reflecting this because you're saying the natural gas. We do run short on natural gas, and they do steal LP gas from the whole area. If Mr. Berardi's here, and because they run short on natural gas. So if this plant is being called to burn 24/7, which it's going to probably be called because it's a cleaner product, then they're going to switch over to oil, and that stinks, and that has bigger emissions than the plant itself.
Betty, you're absolutely right, and that is an excellent question and point to be brought up at the scoping session for them to answer. And I'd like to hear the answer to that myself, as part of the educational process.
And because I'm on that threshold, I had asked Peter directly in a telephone call to bring me his emission status for this plant. He refused to do that. And the problem being is, they have stated that there's a threshold in New York State that they are going to be under. Well, first of all, how far under the threshold? This much or this much? These people cannot even answer questions honestly, and that's a big problem.
Let me just
Can we actually
say something.
I'm sorry.
Nope.
I just want to bring this back, so it's not a debate right now.
Oh, okay.
But,
Let me just address that one quick second. My point, very simply, is these are very valid questions that need to be asked at the scoping session, and that's what we're here to discuss is the format of the scoping session, what it's about, and the
Thank you.
and so forth. And those kind of questions when they're asking in the scoping sessions, questions can't be just poo-pooed and say, I don't want to answer that question. They have to be answered. They can't walk away and say, I'm not going to answer it, because that's part of the process, is to answer the questions. Here's the questions I want to answer.
Now, do
So
those,
there's been some hands that have been patiently waiting up here for quite a while, so sorry, we'll try to get everyone, but.
The secret process has a set